The abandoned animal shelter on the outskirts of Yellowstone was supposed to close its doors forever that cold October morning. Ranger Marcus Webb had seen plenty of discarded animals in his 15 years patrolling the wilderness, but nothing like the massive German Shepherd mix cowering in the corner cage. Scarred, silent, and weighing nearly 120 pounds, the dog had been rejected by 12 families in 6 months. What nobody knew was that Marcus carried his own scars. He'd lost his own search and rescue dog in an avalanche 2 years prior, along with his confidence to ever love another animal. But something about this broken giant called to him. The moment Marcus opened that cage door, the dog's behavior changed dramatically. Instead of cowering, the animal bolted toward the shelter's exit, then stopped and looked back with urgent, intelligent eyes. It was almost as if the dog was trying to tell him something crucial about the wilderness beyond. But what secret was this unwanted giant hiding in those haunted eyes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still gripping the metal gate. The shelter's volunteer coordinator, Sarah Chen, emerged from the back office with a clipboard and tired eyes that had seen too many goodbyes. "I didn't think anyone was coming for him," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and concern. "His name's Bear, though I doubt he'll answer to it. He hasn't responded to much of anything since they brought him in." Bear. The name felt heavy on Marcus's tongue as he studied the dog's posture. The animal remained perfectly still by the exit door, muscles coiled like a spring, but those dark eyes never left Marcus's face. There was something familiar in that gaze, a haunted intelligence that Marcus recognized from looking in mirrors after particularly difficult rescues. "What happened to him?" Marcus asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Sarah flipped through the papers on her clipboard, found wandering near the north entrance back in April, half-starved, dehydrated, covered in scratches and bite marks. The vet thinks he survived in the wild for months, maybe longer. No chip, no collar, no missing dog reports that matched his description. Marcus stepped closer to Bear, noting the deliberate way the dog tracked his movement. This wasn't the random attention of a pet seeking affection. This was the focused awareness of a working animal, one trained for a specific purpose. The families who considered him, Marcus said, what made them change their minds? "Same thing every time." Sarah's voice dropped. He wouldn't settle. Spent every moment trying to get back outside, back to the park. One family said he howled all night, facing toward the mountains. Another said he kept bringing them their hiking boots and jackets. They all thought he was just too wild, too damaged. But Marcus heard something else in those stories. Purpose, direction. This wasn't the behavior of a traumatized animal acting randomly. This was a dog with unfinished business. Bear whined softly, a sound that cut through Marcus like a blade. It was the same whine his previous partner, Kodiak, used to make when they were close to finding someone lost in the wilderness. The hair on Marcus's arm stood up. "I'll take him," he said quietly. Sarah looked up from her clipboard, surprise flickering across her face. "Marcus, I know you've been through a lot since Kodiak. Are you sure you're ready for this? Bear's going to need patience, and honestly, he might never adjust to domestic life." Marcus knelt down slowly, extending his hand toward Bear. The dog approached with careful steps, sniffing once before sitting directly in front of him. Close up, Marcus could see the intricate pattern of scars across the animal's muzzle and shoulders. These weren't random wounds from wilderness survival. Some of these marks looked deliberate, defensive, as if Bear had protected something or someone. "What if he's not meant for domestic life?" Marcus said, more to himself than to Sarah. "What if he's trying to tell us something?" Bear's ears perked forward at the change in Marcus's tone. Slowly, the dog lifted his massive paw and placed it on Marcus's forearm. The gesture was so deliberate, so human-like, that Marcus felt his breath catch. Sarah handed him the adoption papers and a worn red collar she'd pulled from a box. This was around his neck when they found him. No tags, but maybe he'll remember it. As Marcus fastened the collar around Bear's thick neck, the dog's entire body language transformed. His tail lifted slightly, his stance straightened, and for the first time since Marcus had arrived, Bear made a sound, not a whine or a bark, but something closer to a wolf's howl. The sound echoed through the empty shelter and seemed to reach straight into the mountains beyond. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with October's bite. Whatever secrets Bear was carrying, they were about to uncover them together. The veterinary clinic smelled of disinfectant and fear. Jake carried the unconscious dog through the back entrance, his boots squeaking against the linoleum as Dr. Sarah Chen looked up from her charts. Her expression shifted from mild curiosity to alarm as she took in the massive animal draped across his arms. "Jesus, Jake, what happened to this poor thing?" "Found him in Sector 7. Been out there a while by the looks of it." He laid the dog carefully on the examination table, noting how the animal's breathing had grown more labored during the drive down the mountain. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals and examining wounds. The dog's coat, beneath the dirt and matted fur, showed glimpses of what might have once been golden brown. But it was the scars that told the real story, precise, methodical cuts across the shoulders and flanks that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than wilderness accidents. "These aren't from wildlife encounters," Sarah murmured, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Someone did this. Recently, too, within the last few months." Jake's jaw clenched. In 15 years of ranger work, he'd seen plenty of human cruelty, but it never got easier. "Can you save him?" "Maybe. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated. The infections from these wounds..." She trailed off, focusing her penlight into the dog's eyes. "Pupils are responsive. That's good. But Jake, even if he pulls through physically, an animal that's been through this kind of trauma..." "I know. He'd rehabilitated enough injured wildlife to understand the psychological damage often ran deeper than physical wounds, but he fought to stay alive out there. That has to count for something." As if responding to his voice, the dog's eyes fluttered open. Instead of the expected fear or aggression, Jake found himself staring into intelligent brown eyes that seemed almost human in their depth. The animal didn't struggle or panic. Instead, he held Jake's gaze with an intensity that was unsettling. "Well, that's unexpected," Sarah said softly. "Most traumatized animals would be trying to tear your throat out right about now." The dog's tail gave the faintest twitch, not quite a wag, but acknowledgement. Jake reached out slowly, letting the animal sniff his hand before gently stroking the matted fur behind one ear. The dog leaned into the touch, a small whimper escaping his throat. "What's that around his neck?" Sarah pointed to something barely visible beneath the matted fur. Jake carefully parted the hair, revealing a collar so embedded with dirt and debris it was nearly invisible. As he worked to expose it, his fingers found something metal, a tag, corroded but still attached. "Can you sedate him? I need to clean this collar properly." 20 minutes later, with the dog under light sedation and his neck area shaved and cleaned, the collar told its story. Expensive leather, high-quality hardware, and a tag that made Jake's blood run cold. "Rex, if found, call Marcus Coleman," Sarah read over his shoulder. "Jake, that name sounds familiar." It should. The Coleman family had vanished into Glacier National Park 7 months ago, sparking one of the largest search and rescue operations in the region's history. Marcus, his wife Elena, their 12-year-old daughter Sophie, and Rex, their German Shepherd mix, had entered the park for what was supposed to be a 3-day camping trip. They'd never come out. The search had lasted 6 weeks. Jake had personally covered hundreds of miles of terrain, following false leads and dead ends. The family's campsite was found intact, their car still parked at the trailhead, but no trace of the people themselves. The case had been officially suspended after winter weather made further searches impossible. "The Colemans," Jake said quietly. "They went missing last September." Sarah's eyes widened. "But if this is their dog, and he's been in the wilderness this whole time, then maybe they're still out there." The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. 7 months in the Montana wilderness. The odds of survival were astronomical, especially through the brutal winter they'd just endured. But if Rex had survived... The dog stirred slightly, and Jake found those intelligent eyes focused on him again. There was something there, something that went beyond simple animal awareness. Rex was trying to communicate. Jake was certain of it. "I need to make some calls," he said, already pulling out his phone. "The FBI agent who handled the case, Agent Morrison, she's going to want to know about this." As he dialed, Jake kept one hand on Rex's head, feeling the solid warmth of the animal beneath his palm. The dog that everyone had written off, the family that everyone had given up for dead. Maybe there was still hope. Rex's tail thumped once against the table, weak but determined. In that simple gesture, Jake heard a message as clear as spoken words: "Help me find them." The hunt was about to begin again. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a shroud as Marcus made his third trip to the kennel behind his cabin. The massive dog hadn't touched the food from the night before, and its water bowl remained full. Through the chain-link fencing, he could see the animal pressed against the far corner, its scarred flanks rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Not hungry, huh?" Marcus spoke softly, crouching down to the dog's eye level. One amber eye fixed on him, while the other remained clouded with old injury. "Can't say I blame you. Took me weeks to trust anyone after Afghanistan." He'd seen that look before, the hollow stare of a creature that had witnessed too much. It was the same expression he'd caught, glimpsing back at him from mirrors in those first months after his discharge. Marcus opened the kennel door slowly, ignoring every protocol he'd learned about approaching traumatized animals. Something deeper than training guided him as he stepped inside and settled cross-legged on the concrete floor, maintaining distance but offering presence. The dog's muscles tensed, ready to bolt, despite having nowhere to go. But Marcus simply pulled out his phone and began scrolling through emails, reading them aloud in the same monotone voice he'd once used to calm wounded soldiers. Wildlife census reports, budget meeting reminder, complaint about campers leaving trash. He paused at an email from Sheriff Reeves dated 3 days ago. Update on Henderson family search, all active operations suspended pending new evidence. The dog's ear twitched at something in Marcus's voice, the subtle change from administrative boredom to something sharper. Marcus continued reading silently, his jaw tightening with each line. The search had been called off after 4 months. No traces found beyond their abandoned campsite near Eagle's Nest Ridge. Case reclassified from rescue to recovery. He looked up to find the dog watching him intently, as if sensing the shift in emotional current. "You know something about that, don't you?" Marcus whispered. A memory surfaced. Dr. Chen mentioning the dog had been found somewhere in the Eagle's Nest area, though the exact location remained unclear. The timeline was close, too close to be coincidental. Marcus pocketed his phone and studied the animal's scars with new attention. The wounds on its flank weren't random. They formed a pattern consistent with defensive injuries, and the way it favored its right rear leg suggested old trauma, not recent injury. "What did you see out there?" he asked. The dog's response was to lower its massive head onto its paws, but it didn't break eye contact. Something passed between them in that moment. Not trust exactly, but a recognition of shared damage. Marcus spent the next hour in that kennel, alternating between silence and soft conversation. He talked about his own ghosts, about nights when sleep brought nothing but echoes of distant explosions and the faces of people he couldn't save. The dog listened with the patience of a confessor, its breathing gradually deepening into something resembling calm. When Marcus finally stood to leave, the dog lifted its head but didn't retreat further into the corner. Progress, microscopic but real. Back in his cabin, Marcus spread topographical maps across his kitchen table and fired up his laptop. The Henderson family, David and Sarah, along with their 8-year-old daughter Emma, had been experienced hikers from Seattle. Their planned route through the Eagle's Nest wilderness should have been well within their capabilities, yet they'd vanished without a trace on what should have been the 3rd day of their 5-day trek. He cross-referenced the search grid with known wildlife corridors, water sources, and the handful of abandoned mining claims that dotted the region. The official search had covered 15 square miles, involving dozens of volunteers and 2 helicopter sweeps. How does a family simply disappear in terrain that familiar? Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor, reminding him about the weekly staff meeting. He glanced toward the kennel, visible through his kitchen window, where the dog now sat upright, alert and watchful. The smart play would be to surrender the animal to another facility better equipped for rehabilitation. His job was managing wilderness areas, not playing therapist to damaged strays. But as he watched the dog's steady gaze track a pair of ravens circling overhead, Marcus recognized something he'd learned in the military. Sometimes intelligence comes from the most unlikely sources. He grabbed his truck keys and headed for the door. The supply run to town could wait, and the staff meeting would have to proceed without him. Right now, he needed to visit the Eagle's Nest area himself to see what the official search might have missed. As he passed the kennel, the dog rose to its feet and approached the fence. For the first time since Marcus had brought it home, the animal seemed interested in something beyond mere survival. "I'll be back," Marcus promised, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the dog or to the ghosts of a missing family that might still be calling from somewhere deep in the wilderness. The morning arrived grey and cold, with frost painting the windows of the ranger station in crystalline patterns. Marcus had slept poorly, haunted by dreams of the massive dog's amber eyes and the desperate intelligence he'd glimpsed within them. He'd made coffee before dawn and sat watching the kennels through the window, noting how the other dogs gave the newcomer's enclosure a wide berth, as if sensing something beyond mere size and scars. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived earlier than expected, her veterinary kit in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. Marcus had worked with her for 3 years, ever since she'd taken over the wildlife clinic from old Doc Peterson. She was thorough, unflappable, and had a way with traumatized animals that bordered on mystical. "So this is our mystery patient," she said, stopping at the kennel door. The dog lay in the far corner, massive head resting on enormous paws, watching them with those unsettling amber eyes. Even lying down, his shoulder height was obvious, easily over 30 inches. "My God, Marcus, what is he?" "That's what I was hoping you'd tell me." Marcus unlocked the kennel door slowly. "I've never seen anything like him." Sarah entered with the calm confidence that made her so effective. She didn't approach the dog directly, but instead sat on the concrete floor about 8 feet away, letting him study her. "Hello, beautiful," she said softly. "Look at you. Someone really put you through hell, didn't they?" The dog's ears twitched forward slightly at her voice, but he remained motionless. "Those scars," Sarah continued, her voice maintaining that soothing tone while her trained eyes catalogued injuries. "Some are old, some newer. This wasn't from one incident." She reached slowly into her kit, withdrawing a small treat. "He's been surviving on his own for months, maybe longer. Look at the muscle definition under that coat. This dog has been working hard to stay alive." She tossed the treat gently. It landed halfway between them. The dog's nostrils flared, but he didn't move toward it. Marcus watched from just outside the kennel. He wouldn't eat yesterday either. Drank some water after I left him alone for a few hours. "Trust issues," Sarah murmured. "Understandable." She sat perfectly still for 10 minutes, occasionally speaking in low tones, before the dog finally rose and approached the treat. He took it delicately, never taking his eyes off her, then retreated to his corner. "Progress," she said. "Now, let's see if we can get a closer look." The examination took nearly an hour. Sarah moved with infinite patience, narrating each action before she performed it, letting the dog process her intentions. When she finally managed to run her hands along his flanks, checking old wounds and feeling for embedded objects, Marcus saw something remarkable happen. The dog's rigid posture relaxed incrementally, and for brief moments his eyes would drift closed. "He remembers being cared for," Sarah said quietly. "This isn't a feral animal, Marcus. This is someone's companion, someone who loved him very much." She found 3 healed bullet wounds, all from small caliber rounds, that had passed through muscle without hitting vital organs. The largest scar ran from his right shoulder to his chest, a knife wound by her estimation. Newer injuries included infected cuts on his pads and a partially healed gash along his left rear leg. "He's been in at least one serious fight," Sarah said, as she cleaned the infected areas. "But look at his teeth, his claws. He's been hunting, fishing even. See these scratches on his muzzle? That's from going after fish in shallow streams. This dog has been using every survival skill he possesses." As she worked, something extraordinary happened. The dog began to make a sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a vocalization. It was rhythmic, almost conversational, as if he were trying to communicate something specific. Sarah paused, her hands still on his flank. "Marcus, are you hearing this?" "Yeah, he did something similar yesterday when I found him. It's like he's trying to tell us something." The dog continued the strange vocalization, his amber eyes fixed intently on Marcus now. There was something desperate in that gaze, something that went beyond fear or pain. "I've never heard anything quite like it," Sarah said. "It's almost like—" She trailed off, thinking. "Like he's trying to lead us somewhere. Have you ever seen a dog try to get humans to follow them to something important?" Marcus had indeed. Search and rescue dogs, tracking dogs, even family pets who'd led their owners to injured hikers or lost children. But this felt different. This felt urgent in a way that raised the hair on his arms. "What are you trying to tell us, boy?" Marcus asked, stepping closer to the kennel. The dog immediately stood, moved to the front of the enclosure, and repeated the vocalization more insistently. His entire body language changed, becoming alert and purposeful. He looked toward the forest beyond the station, then back at Marcus, then toward the forest again. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "this dog wants to show you something." The morning air carried the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke as Marcus led Bear down a narrow trail that wound deeper into the backcountry. 3 days had passed since their discovery of the torn fabric, and the dog's behavior had grown increasingly agitated with each mile they covered. Bear's massive head swiveled constantly, his scarred ears twitching at sounds Marcus couldn't detect. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured, adjusting his pack. The weight of emergency supplies, rope and medical kit pressed against his shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the weight of uncertainty that had settled in his chest since Sheriff Kowalski's visit. The Hendricks family had been missing for 4 months now. Tom, his wife Sarah, and their twin daughters, Emma and Grace, aged 7. They'd registered for a 3-day camping permit at the ranger station, an experienced family with proper gear and a sensible itinerary. Then they'd simply vanished, leaving behind only their abandoned campsite and a mystery that had consumed dozens of searchers. Bear suddenly stopped, his body rigid as granite. A low whine escaped his throat, barely audible but filled with such anguish that Marcus felt his skin prickle. The dog's nose pointed toward a cluster of boulders 30 yards off the main trail, partially hidden by overgrown manzanita bushes. "What is it?" Marcus whispered, though he already knew. Bear had found something. They pushed through the undergrowth, branches catching at their clothes. The air grew colder here, trapped in the shadow of towering Douglas firs. Bear's whining intensified as they approached the rocks, and Marcus noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Scratches in the stone, deliberate marks that looked almost like arrows. Behind the largest boulder, Marcus discovered the entrance to what appeared to be an old mining cave, its mouth partially concealed by fallen timber and decades of accumulated debris. The darkness beyond seemed to swallow light, but Bear was already moving toward it, his massive body trembling with barely contained emotion. Marcus pulled out his flashlight, the beam revealing rough-hewn walls that disappeared into blackness. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Anyone there?" Only silence answered, but Bear was already entering the cave, his claws scraping against stone. Marcus had no choice but to follow. The tunnel extended farther than he'd expected, widening into a natural chamber about 20 feet across. His flashlight beams swept the walls, revealing more scratches, some clearly made by tools, others that might have been clawed by desperate fingers. Then the light found something that stopped his breath entirely. A child's sneaker, small and pink with faded cartoon characters on the side. Beside it, a torn piece of yellow fabric that matched the sample in his pocket. "Jesus," Marcus breathed, kneeling beside the items. The sneaker was tiny, designed for a 7-year-old foot. Emma or Grace Hendricks, it had to be. Bear had moved to the far wall of the chamber, where he sat with his back pressed against the stone, his massive head tilted upward in a pose that somehow conveyed both grief and hope. As Marcus approached with the flashlight, he saw what had drawn the dog's attention. More scratches covered this section of wall, but these were different, purposeful and organized. Letters carved into the stone with painstaking effort. Marcus traced them with his finger, his heart hammering as the message became clear. "Help us. Cave in, going deeper. Tom." Below that, in smaller letters, Bear escaped. "Tell him we're trying." Marcus stared at the words, his mind reeling. Bear hadn't just found the family, he'd been with them when something had trapped them underground. The dog had somehow escaped and been searching for help ever since. Those scars, that haunted look in his eyes, the way he'd approached the ranger station as if he knew exactly what he needed to do. "They're alive," Marcus whispered, and Bear's tail thumped once against the stone, a sound like a judge's gavel. "How long ago was this, boy? How far did they go?" The cave continued past the chamber, branching into multiple passages that disappeared into the mountain's heart. The Hendricks family was somewhere in that maze, possibly injured, certainly running low on supplies after 4 months underground. Every day of delay could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. Marcus pulled out his satellite phone, praying for enough signal to reach the outside world. The screen showed one flickering bar, barely enough, but it would have to do. As he dialed the emergency number, Bear stood and padded toward one of the tunnels, looking back expectantly. The dog knew where they were. After months of searching, after giving up hope, Bear was ready to lead him home. Marcus just hoped they wouldn't be too late. "This is Ranger Cole," he said when the dispatcher answered. "I need a full cave rescue team at the abandoned Copper Creek mine. And tell them to bring everything. We're going deep." The morning air carried a bite that made Marcus pull his jacket tighter as he watched Bear pace the perimeter of the cabin's small yard. The dog moved with purpose now, no longer the broken creature that had arrived 3 weeks ago. His massive frame had filled out, the ribs no longer visible beneath his thick coat, but the scars remained, white lines mapping a history Marcus was only beginning to understand. Sarah Chen had called an hour earlier with news that made his coffee grow cold. "We found something," she'd said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "About 15 miles north of where you found Bear. Old campsite partially buried under the rock slide from last winter." Marcus had driven the winding mountain roads with Bear beside him. The dog's ears pricked forward as if he sensed their destination. Now, standing at the edge of what had once been a family's refuge, Marcus felt the familiar weight of unfinished stories pressing against his chest. The campsite told a tale of sudden departure. A blue tarp stretched between 2 pine trees, one corner torn and flapping in the wind. Scattered camping gear poked through the debris, a dented pot, children's clothing wrapped around a tree branch like prayer flags, a waterlogged backpack with Natalie written in permanent marker across the front pocket. "The registration matches," Sarah said, crouching beside what remained of a fire ring. "David and Elena Martinez, kids Natalie and Sam. They were supposed to check out of the campground 6 months ago." She gestured toward a flattened tent partially buried under rocks and fallen branches. Storm hit hard that week. Multiple mudslides, several search and rescue calls. Bear had wandered to the far edge of the site, nose to the ground, following some invisible trail that meant nothing to Marcus but everything to the dog. His tail wagged once, a tentative flag of recognition. "He knows this place," Marcus said, watching the dog's careful investigation of a cluster of boulders. Sarah followed his gaze. The question is what happened to the family, and how Bear survived when they didn't. A child sneaker, small and red with cartoon characters faded by weather, lay wedged between two rocks. Marcus picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Size 12, maybe 7 or 8 years old. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size. There, Bear's sharp bark cut through his thoughts. The dog stood rigid beside a gap in the rockfall, his massive head pointed toward a dark opening barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Marcus approached carefully, pulling out his flashlight. The beam revealed a narrow passage that seemed to continue beyond the range of the light. "Sarah, you need to see this." She joined him, her own light adding to his. "Could be a natural cave system. These mountains are full of them." She paused, studying Bear's posture. "He wants us to go in." The passage opened into a wider chamber after 20 feet of crawling over loose rock and debris. Marcus emerged first, sweeping his light across limestone walls that stretched up into darkness. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something that made his stomach tighten with dread. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Her light had found what Bear had been trying to show them. A makeshift shelter built against the far wall, backpacks arranged as windbreaks, a small pile of emergency food containers, most empty, and in the center, covered by a sleeping bag, the unmistakable shape of human remains. But only one. Marcus forced himself to approach, while Sarah radioed for backup. The sleeping bag covered what appeared to be an adult male, based on the hiking boots visible at one end. Beside the body, a waterproof notebook lay open, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "Day 12 in the cave," Marcus read aloud, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Elena's fever is worse. The kids are scared but trying to be brave. Bear keeps watch at the entrance, won't let anything near us." He flipped back through the pages, the story emerging in fragments. The family had been caught in the storm, their campsite destroyed by the mudslide that created the cave entrance. David Martinez had broken his leg in the initial collapse. They'd taken shelter in the natural cave, waiting for rescue that never came. Day 18. Food almost gone. Elena took the kids to look for help. Should reach the ranger station by tomorrow if she follows the creek bed. Told her to leave Bear with me, but the dog followed them. Smart animal knows the mountains better than any of us. The final entries grew weaker, more erratic. David Martinez had died alone, believing his family had found safety. But if Bear had followed Elena and the children, where were they now? And how had the dog ended up injured and alone, 15 miles away? Bear whined softly from the cave entrance, his massive form silhouetted against the dim light filtering in from outside. Whatever had happened in these mountains 6 months ago, whatever tragedy had torn this family apart, the scarred dog was the only witness left alive, and he was trying to tell them something they weren't yet ready to understand. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a shroud, as Marcus led Bear deeper into the wilderness than they'd ventured before. The massive dog moved with increasing confidence, his scarred muzzle occasionally lifting to test the air currents that wound between the towering pines. Something had changed in Bear's demeanor overnight, a restless energy that had kept them both awake, pacing the cabin until dawn broke. Marcus adjusted his pack, heavy with emergency supplies he hoped they wouldn't need. The GPS coordinates he'd marked yesterday felt like breadcrumbs leading into a fairy tale that might not have a happy ending. But Bear's certainty was infectious, and Marcus found himself trusting instincts he'd long buried under years of protocol and procedure. They'd been hiking for 2 hours when Bear suddenly froze, his entire body rigid with attention. The dog's ears swiveled forward, and a low whine escaped his throat, not of fear, but of recognition. Marcus knelt beside him, following Bear's gaze through the dense undergrowth. "What is it, boy? What do you hear?" Bear took 3 deliberate steps forward, then looked back at Marcus, his amber eyes holding an intelligence that still caught the ranger off guard. Without hesitation, the dog plunged into a thicket of mountain laurel, leaving Marcus no choice but to follow. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they climbed. Loose shale shifted under their feet, and more than once Marcus had to grab exposed roots to keep from sliding backward. Bear navigated the obstacles with surprising grace for such a large animal, his powerful hindquarters propelling him up rocky ledges that would challenge an experienced climber. They emerged onto a narrow ridge that Marcus had never mapped, though he'd thought he knew every square mile of this territory. The view stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills dotted with clearings, distant peaks shrouded in clouds, and far below, the silver ribbon of Whitman Creek winding through the valley floor. Bear padded to the edge of the ridge and sat, his massive head tilted as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Then he began to bark, deep resonant calls that echoed across the wilderness and seemed to hang in the thin mountain air. Marcus pulled out his binoculars and scanned the landscape below, searching for any sign of movement or disturbance. The forest appeared pristine and empty, but something nagged at him. A flash of color that didn't belong among the natural greens and browns caught his attention. He adjusted the focus, squinting against the morning sun. There, a small patch of bright blue fabric snagged on a dead branch near the creek, too vivid to be anything but man-made. His pulse quickened as he traced the terrain between their current position and the spot below. It would take at least an hour to reach it safely, longer if the undergrowth was as thick as it appeared. Bear had stopped barking but remained alert, his nose working constantly. The dog turned to Marcus with what could only be described as urgency, then began picking his way down a barely visible game trail that seemed to lead in the direction of the blue fabric. The descent proved even more challenging than the climb up. Marcus's boots slipped on wet leaves and thorny vines caught at his clothing. Bear waited patiently whenever the ranger fell behind, but his body language conveyed increasing agitation. Whatever memories or instincts drove the dog forward, they were growing stronger. Halfway down the slope, Bear suddenly veered off the trail and disappeared behind a massive boulder. Marcus heard excited whining and what sounded like digging. He pushed through a curtain of hanging moss to find Bear pawing at a small depression in the rocky ground. Kneeling beside the dog, Marcus brushed away leaves and debris to reveal clear impressions in the dried mud, boot prints, adult-sized and relatively fresh despite exposure to the elements. His trained eye immediately noted the distinctive tread pattern of hiking boots and nearby smaller prints that could only belong to children. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "You found them." Bear looked up from his digging, dirt coating his scarred muzzle, then bounded away again, following what Marcus now recognized as a faint trail of disturbed vegetation. The Hartley family had passed this way, and recently enough that their passage remained readable to someone who knew how to look. The trail led steadily downward toward the creek, but it wandered erratically, suggesting confusion or perhaps injury. Marcus's concern deepened as he noticed places where the ground was scuffed, as if someone had fallen or been dragged. Bear moved with increasing urgency, occasionally stopping to sniff at broken branches or disturbed earth before pushing forward again. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the creek bottom. Through the trees ahead, Marcus could see sunlight reflecting off moving water. Bear broke into a loping run, and Marcus hurried to keep up, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Whatever they found at the creek would change everything. He could feel it in his bones, in the way Bear moved with desperate purpose, in the way the very air seemed to thicken with possibility. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers as Marcus led Bear deeper into the wilderness than they'd ever ventured together. 3 days had passed since their discovery at the abandoned campsite, and the weight of what they'd found pressed against Marcus's chest with every step. The child's shoe, the torn fabric, the signs of struggle, all of it pointed to something far more sinister than a simple family getting lost. Bear moved with purpose now, his massive frame cutting through the underbrush with an urgency that made Marcus's pulse quicken. The dog's behavior had shifted dramatically since finding those remnants. Gone was the hesitant, traumatized animal Marcus had first encountered. In its place walked a creature driven by something deeper than instinct, a need that bordered on obsession. "Easy, boy." Marcus murmured as Bear strained against the long lead, his scarred muzzle pressed low to the ground. The dog's breathing came in sharp, controlled bursts, processing scents invisible to human senses. "We'll find them." The trail led them through a section of the park Marcus rarely patrolled, a maze of granite outcroppings and dense pine groves where the official hiking paths gave way to game trails and forgotten deer runs. His radio had lost signal an hour ago, leaving them truly isolated in the vast wilderness. Bear suddenly froze, his entire body going rigid. A low whine escaped his throat, not of fear but of recognition. Marcus felt the hair on his arms stand up as he followed the dog's gaze to a cluster of boulders ahead, their surfaces blackened by what looked like old fire damage. "What is it?" Marcus whispered, though he already knew Bear couldn't answer. The dog's eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved him, as if the animal understood far more than any creature should. They approached the rocks cautiously. The acrid smell of long-dead smoke still lingered in the air, mixing with something else, something organic and wrong that made Marcus's stomach turn. Bear's whining grew more insistent, and he began pawing at a gap between two of the larger stones. Marcus knelt beside him, peering into the crevice. At first, he saw nothing but shadows and debris. Then his eyes adjusted, and his breath caught in his throat. Wedged deep in the gap was a backpack, bright blue with cartoon characters dancing across its surface, a child's backpack. "Jesus," he breathed, reaching for his radio before remembering it was useless out here. His hands shook as he carefully extracted the bag from its hiding place. The fabric was torn and stained, but the contents were partially intact. A coloring book with half the pages missing, broken crayons scattered in the bottom, and tucked into the front pocket, a small plastic wallet containing a library card bearing the name Emma Hartley, the missing daughter. She'd been here. Bear's agitation increased, and he began circling the area with frantic energy. His nose swept the ground in wide arcs, picking up trails Marcus couldn't even imagine. The dog's scarred hide rippled with tension as he worked, and Marcus found himself wondering again what horrors this animal had witnessed. A sharp bark echoed off the rocks as Bear located something else. This time, it was a piece of torn clothing caught on a thorny bush, adult-sized, the fabric expensive and outdoor-appropriate, like something Richard Hartley might have worn. Marcus's radio crackled suddenly, a burst of static that made him jump. He grabbed for it, hoping the signal had returned, but found only silence. The sound had come from somewhere else. Bear heard it too. The dog's ears swiveled like satellite dishes, homing in on a direction deeper into the woods. Another burst of static, faint but unmistakable. Someone else was out here with a radio. Every instinct screamed at Marcus to turn back, to return to cell coverage and call for backup. This was beyond what one man and one dog could handle, but as he looked into Bear's eyes, he saw something that made him reconsider. The dog wasn't afraid, he was determined. "You know where they are, don't you?" Marcus asked quietly. "You've been trying to get back to them this whole time." Bear's tail gave a single, deliberate wag. Then he was moving again, pulling Marcus toward the sound of the radio. The forest seemed to close around them as they descended into a ravine Marcus had never seen before, its steep sides creating a natural corridor that felt more like a trap than a path. The radio crackled again, closer now. And beneath the static, Marcus thought he heard something else, a voice, weak and desperate, calling for help. His hand instinctively moved to the service weapon at his hip as he realized they were no longer searching for missing persons. They were walking into something that had been carefully hidden, something that someone had gone to great lengths to keep secret. Bear pressed forward into the shadows, and Marcus followed, knowing that whatever they found would change everything. The storm hit without warning, turning the forest into a churning maze of wind and rain. Marcus pressed himself against the trunk of a massive pine, squinting through the downpour as Bear paced restlessly beside him. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly agitated over the past hour, whining and pawing at the muddy ground despite the worsening weather. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured, but his own nerves were fraying. They'd been following Bear's lead for 3 days now, deeper into the back country than he'd ventured in years. The dog seemed to know exactly where he was going, following scent trails invisible to human senses, but the approaching storm threatened to wash away whatever fragile leads remained. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in stark white flashes. In one brief moment of clarity, Marcus caught sight of something that made his breath catch. A flash of blue fabric snagged on a branch about 50 yards ahead. He grabbed Bear's collar as the dog lunged forward, both of them fighting through the wind toward the anomaly. The fabric was synthetic, bright blue with reflective strips, a piece of a child's jacket. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he examined the tear pattern. It looked fresh, certainly not weathered enough to have been hanging here for months. Bear was practically vibrating with energy, his nose working frantically despite the rain. "What do you smell, boy?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Is it them?" As if in answer, Bear suddenly bolted, his powerful frame disappearing into the underbrush. Marcus cursed and gave chase, crashing through wet branches and sliding down muddy slopes. The storm was making tracking nearly impossible, but he could hear the dog barking somewhere ahead, not his usual bark, but something urgent and demanding. The sound led him to a steep ravine he'd never encountered before, its walls carved smooth by decades of runoff. At the bottom, barely visible through sheets of rain, Marcus could make out the dark mouth of what appeared to be a cave or deep overhang. Bear stood at the edge of the ravine, looking back at Marcus with unmistakable intent. "You've got to be kidding me," Marcus muttered, but he was already searching for a way down. The walls were slick with rain, but exposed tree roots provided handholds. He made the descent carefully, Bear somehow managing to scramble down beside him with surprising grace for such a large animal. The cave opening was larger than it had appeared from above, tall enough for a person to stand upright and extending back into darkness. More importantly, it was dry. Marcus pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the interior, revealing something that made his heart race. Recent human habitation. A small fire ring made of carefully arranged stones sat near the entrance, cold but not ancient. Scattered around it were clear signs of occupancy: a water bottle, energy bar wrappers, and most tellingly, a child's sneaker lying on its side against the cave wall. Bear was practically dancing with excitement now, his tail wagging furiously as he sniffed at every surface. Marcus picked up the sneaker, size 2, pink with cartoon characters. It matched the description Sarah had given him of what Emma was wearing the day she disappeared. "They were here," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "They're alive." But as he examined the scene more closely, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the storm. The fire ring was cold, not just recently extinguished, but cold enough to suggest it hadn't been used in days, maybe weeks. The energy bar wrappers were scattered as if dropped in haste. And there were other signs, darker ones that spoke to his years of experience reading crime scenes. Scuff marks in the dirt near the cave mouth, signs of a struggle, or at least a hurried departure. Most disturbing of all, when he moved deeper into the cave, his flashlight beam revealed what looked like restraints, zip ties that had been cut, lying discarded in the shadows. The family hadn't just been camping here, they'd been held here. Bear had moved to the back of the cave, his low growl echoing off the stone walls. Marcus followed, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. But they were too deep in the wilderness for any signal to get through, and the storm would make helicopter rescue impossible even if he could call for help. At the rear of the cave, Bear was pawing at what looked like loose stones. When Marcus moved them aside, his light revealed a crude message scratched into the rock, taken north: "Tell Sarah we love her. Mike." The timestamp carved below the message made Marcus's blood run cold. It was dated just 4 days ago. Thunder crashed overhead as the full implications hit him. The Hendricks family was alive, but they were no longer here by choice. Someone had taken them, and that someone had a 4-day head start. But they also had something the kidnapper didn't expect: a massive, scarred dog who remembered their scent and a ranger who wouldn't give up. The storm hit with a vengeance just after midnight, turning the mountain trail into a treacherous maze of mud and loose rock. Marcus pressed himself against the cliff face, his headlamp cutting through sheets of rain that seemed determined to wash him back down the mountain. Beside him, Kane's massive frame trembled, not from cold, but from something deeper. The dog's scarred muzzle pointed upward toward the hidden cave system they'd been tracking for 3 days. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, though his own nerves were frayed. The GPS coordinates from the Henderson's final transmission had led them here, to this god-forsaken ledge 200 feet above the valley floor. If Sarah's theory was right, if the family had taken shelter in these caves when the weather turned bad 6 months ago, then somewhere in the darkness above lay the answers they'd been seeking. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the narrow path ahead. Kane whined and pawed at Marcus's leg, his eyes reflecting the brief flash of light. The dog had been acting strange all evening, alternating between eager determination and anxious pacing. Marcus had learned to trust those instincts. Whatever had happened to the Henderson family, Kane remembered. The climb took another hour. Marcus's fingers went numb from gripping rain-slick handholds, and twice he had to boost Kane up particularly steep sections. The dog's weight was substantial, but his trust was absolute. He never struggled or panicked, simply let Marcus guide him to safety before continuing their ascent. The cave mouth appeared suddenly, a black void carved into the mountainside. Marcus swept his light across the entrance, noting the way the rock had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and water. It was large enough for a family to shelter in, deep enough to escape the worst of a mountain storm. His pulse quickened. Kane bolted forward before Marcus could stop him, disappearing into the darkness with an urgency that made Marcus's stomach clench. He followed, his headlamp beam dancing across limestone walls and scattered debris. The air was musty but dry, carrying scents of old smoke and something else, something that made Kane whimper from somewhere deeper in the cave. "Kane!" Marcus called softly, his voice echoing off unseen walls. He moved carefully over the uneven floor, noting the blackened circle where someone had built a fire. His light caught something metallic, and he knelt to examine it. A camping stove, expensive and well-maintained, the kind the Hendersons would have carried on their hiking trip. Kane's barking echoed from deeper in the cave system, urgent and distressed. Marcus followed the sound through a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber. His light found Kane first, the dog pawing frantically at a pile of rocks near the far wall. Then Marcus saw what had captured the animal's attention, and his blood turned cold. A hiking boot protruded from beneath the rockfall, adult-sized, muddy, but intact. Marcus rushed forward, Kane backing away to give him room. With trembling hands he began moving stones, each one revealing more of what lay beneath. A leg, then a torso, then the pale face of a man in his 40s. David Henderson, according to the missing persons file Marcus had memorized. But David Henderson wasn't dead. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. "Jesus," Marcus breathed, dropping to his knees beside the unconscious man. He pressed 2 fingers to David's neck, feeling a weak but steady pulse. Dehydration, hypothermia, probable internal injuries from the rockfall, but alive. Impossibly, incredibly alive after 6 months in this cave. Kane whined and nudged Marcus's shoulder, then trotted toward another section of the chamber. The dog's message was clear, there were others. Marcus's light followed Kane's path and found them huddled against the back wall, a woman and 2 children, all unconscious but breathing. The entire Henderson family, somehow surviving in this limestone tomb while the world above had given them up for dead. Marcus keyed his radio with shaking fingers. "Base, this is Ranger Collins. I need immediate medical evacuation at my coordinates. 4 survivors found, all in critical condition. Repeat, the Henderson family is alive." Static filled the cave for several long seconds before Sarah's voice crackled through. "Copy that, Marcus. Birds are grounded due to weather, but we'll have a ground team moving as soon as the storm passes. How bad are they?" Marcus looked at David's grey complexion, at the children's still forms. Bad. They need fluids, warmth, and medical attention immediately. I'm going to do what I can, but you found them, Marcus. That's the hard part. Keep them stable until we can reach you. As Marcus began checking each family member's condition and setting up his emergency shelter, Kane settled beside David Henderson with a heavy sigh. The dog's scarred head rested on his paws, his vigil finally complete. Whatever trauma had bound this animal to the Henderson family's fate, whatever memories had driven him to lead Marcus up this mountain, Kane had fulfilled his purpose. The storm raged outside, but inside the cave, hope had returned to the darkness. The storm hit with a vengeance just as they reached the base of Eagle's Ridge. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter against the driving rain, squinting through the downpour at the rocky outcropping ahead. Bear pressed close to his leg, the dog's massive frame trembling, not from cold, but from something else entirely. The same agitation that had been building in him for the past hour. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured, but his own nerves were fraying. They'd been following Bear's lead for 3 days now, tracking scent trails invisible to human senses, and the dog had never shown this kind of distress before. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the jagged cliff face for a brief moment. In that flash, Marcus caught sight of something that made his blood run cold, a section of rock that looked wrong somehow, too smooth, too deliberate. He pulled out his flashlight, fighting against the wind to keep the beam steady. There, carved into the stone, barely visible beneath years of weather and lichen growth, were symbols, not natural formations, but deliberate markings. His heart hammered as recognition dawned. He'd seen similar carvings before, in case files from other missing persons investigations across the state. Cases that had gone cold, cases where people simply vanished without a trace. Bear whined, a low sound that cut through the storm's howl. The dog was focused on a narrow gap between 2 boulders. His scarred muzzle pointed toward what looked like impenetrable darkness. Marcus approached carefully, his ranger training kicking in despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The gap was wider than it appeared from a distance, easily large enough for a person to squeeze through. He aimed his flashlight into the opening and his breath caught, footprints in the mud partially protected from the rain by the rock overhang, fresh enough to still hold their shape. "Someone's been here recently," he whispered to Bear, who had already started pushing through the gap. Marcus followed, his jacket scraping against stone as he squeezed into what revealed itself to be a narrow canyon, invisible from the main trail. The canyon twisted deeper into the mountain than seemed possible, and with each step, Marcus felt the weight of discovery pressing down on him. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a deliberate maze, designed to confuse and disorient, the kind of place where someone could disappear forever. Bear moved with purpose now, his earlier agitation replaced by focused determination. His nose stayed low to the ground, following a scent trail that grew stronger with each turn. They passed more carved symbols, and Marcus photographed each one with his phone, though he doubted the images would capture the menacing quality they possessed in the flickering beam of his flashlight. The canyon opened into a wider chamber, and Marcus froze. The space had been modified, roughly hewn shells carved into the rock walls, fire-blackened stones arranged in a circle and scattered throughout the area, personal belongings that didn't belong to any wilderness setting. A child's backpack, faded and water-stained, a woman's hiking boot, a man's watch, its face cracked but still ticking. "Jesus," Marcus breathed. This wasn't just where the Brennan family had disappeared. This was a collection point. Evidence of multiple disappearances, spanning who knew how long. Bear's growl rumbled deep in his chest, a warning that raised every hair on Marcus's neck. They weren't alone. The voice came from the shadows beyond his flashlight's reach, calm and conversational, as if they were meeting at a coffee shop instead of in this nightmare cave. "I was wondering when someone would finally follow the dog back here." Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but the voice continued, amused. "No signal down here, Ranger Hayes. These old mining tunnels are like natural Faraday cages, very private, very isolated." The beam of another flashlight clicked on, temporarily blinding Marcus. When his vision cleared, he found himself facing a figure in ranger clothes, the wrong ranger clothes. Someone wearing the uniform but wearing it wrong, like a costume rather than professional gear. "You've been very persistent," the figure continued, and Marcus's blood chilled as he recognized the voice from radio communications over the past months. Someone who'd had access to search coordinates, who'd known exactly where to avoid, who'd been one step ahead of every investigation. "Where's the family?" Marcus demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. Bear had positioned himself between Marcus and the stranger, every muscle in the dog's scarred body coiled for action. "Safe," came the reply. "For now. But that depends entirely on what happens next." Thunder crashed overhead, the sound echoing through the cavern system like a gunshot. In that moment of chaos, Marcus realized with crystal clarity that they weren't here for a rescue anymore. They were here for a confrontation that had been building since the day he'd first found Bear bleeding and broken by the roadside. The dog had indeed been the key to finding the missing family. But that key had also unlocked something far more dangerous than Marcus had ever imagined. The helicopter's rotors beat a steady rhythm overhead as Marcus traced the coordinates Titan had led them to on his GPS. The rescue team had arrived within hours of his radio call, but the dense canopy made landing impossible in this section of the wilderness. They'd have to extract the survivors on foot to the nearest clearing, still 2 miles away. Dr. Sarah Chen worked methodically over the unconscious man while her partner stabilized the woman. Both victims showed signs of severe dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure. The man's leg bore clear evidence of an old break that had healed poorly, explaining why they'd never made it out on their own. "Vital signs are weak but stable," Chen reported into her radio. "We need to move them soon, but they're going to need 4S en route. This is remarkable. They shouldn't have survived this long without proper shelter and food sources." Marcus knelt beside Titan, who hadn't left the cave entrance since the medical team arrived. The dog's massive frame trembled slightly, not from cold but from what seemed like overwhelming emotion. His scarred muzzle rested on his paws as he watched the strangers tend to the people he'd been protecting. "You did good, boy," Marcus murmured, running his hand along Titan's neck. "You kept them alive." Sheriff Rodriguez approached, notebook in hand. "Marcus, I need to understand this timeline. The Hendersons disappeared 8 months ago. You found Titan when?" 6 months ago. He was half dead, covered in wounds, refusing help from everyone. Marcus's eyes never left the dog. He must have been trying to lead people back here all along. Every time he ran off, every time he seemed aggressive, he wasn't being hostile. He was trying to communicate. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. How many times had Titan attempted to guide other hikers or rangers toward this location? How many opportunities had been missed because everyone saw a dangerous, damaged animal instead of a desperate guardian? Dr. Chen looked up from her patient. "There's something else. The woman, she's been trying to say something. It sounds like Titan." Marcus moved quickly to the woman's side. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. When she spotted the massive dog at the cave entrance, tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Titan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good boy. Such a good boy." The dog's ears perked forward. He looked to Marcus, seeking permission, and when Marcus nodded, Titan slowly approached. Despite his size, he moved with infinite gentleness, lowering his great head so the woman could touch his scarred face with trembling fingers. "He saved us," she continued, each word an effort. "After James fell, after I hurt my shoulder, Titan found us, brought us here, brought us food, water from the stream, never left us." Sheriff Rodriguez scribbled notes furiously. "Ma'am, are you Karen Henderson?" She nodded weakly. "My husband, James. Is he—" "He's going to be fine," Dr. Chen assured her. "You both are. Thanks to this dog and Ranger Matthews here." As the medical team prepared the Hendersons for transport, Marcus pieced together the story. The couple had gotten lost during what should have been a simple day hike. James had fallen, breaking his leg, and Karen had dislocated her shoulder trying to help him. They'd found minimal shelter, but exposure would have killed them within days. That's when Titan had found them. A massive, scarred dog who had every reason to distrust humans but chose to help instead. For months, he'd kept them alive, bringing them water in his mouth from the nearby stream, delivering small game he'd caught, even dragging larger pieces of deadfall to improve their shelter. When their supplies dwindled and hypothermia set in, he'd shared his body heat through the coldest nights, all while trying desperately to lead someone, anyone, back to save them. The evacuation took 3 hours. Marcus and Titan flanked the stretcher teams, the dog's presence seeming to calm both survivors whenever they stirred to consciousness. At the landing zone, as the medical helicopter prepared for takeoff, Karen Henderson gripped Marcus's hand. "Take care of him," she said. "He's special, more than special." Marcus watched the helicopter disappear over the tree line, carrying the Hendersons toward the hospital and recovery. Beside him, Titan sat perfectly still, his job finally complete. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked. "Ready to go home?" For the first time since Marcus had known him, Titan's tail wagged. Not the tentative movement Marcus had seen before, but a full, enthusiastic display of joy. The dog pressed against Marcus's leg, and Marcus realized they'd both been transformed by this experience. They walked back through the wilderness together, no longer ranger and rescue dog, but partners who'd proven that sometimes the most broken things could become the strongest. Behind them, the cave stood empty, its secret finally revealed, its guardian's vigil finally ended. The forest seemed different now, less mysterious and more like home. The wind cut through Marcus's jacket like ice as he crouched beside Titan in the pre-dawn darkness. 3 days had passed since their discovery at the mining camp, and the search had expanded into a full-scale operation that stretched across 20 square miles of unforgiving wilderness. State police, FBI agents, and volunteer searchers had descended upon the area, but so far they'd found nothing more than scattered pieces of camping gear and tire tracks that disappeared into rocky terrain. Marcus studied the topographical map spread across his lap, marking off the areas they'd already covered. Red X's dotted the paper like wounds, each one representing another dead end, another hope extinguished. The Hartwell family had been missing for 4 months now, and with each passing hour, the likelihood of finding them alive diminished. Titan's ears suddenly perked up, his massive head turning toward the northeast. The dog's nostrils flared as he tested the air, and Marcus felt the familiar tension that had learned to recognize as Titan's hunting mode. Something was out there. "What is it, boy?" Marcus whispered, folding the map and stuffing it into his pack. "You got something?" The dog rose to his feet, those intelligent brown eyes fixed on something Marcus couldn't see or smell. Titan's tail hung low, not wagging but alert, and there was something in his posture that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. It wasn't the excited energy of tracking game, or even the focused intensity they'd seen when following the scent trails from the camp. This was different, darker. Marcus checked his radio and GPS unit, then shouldered his pack. "Lead the way." They moved through the forest in the grey half-light before sunrise, Titan setting a steady pace along what appeared to be an old logging road. The path was overgrown with scrub brush and fallen branches, barely visible beneath years of accumulated debris. Marcus had to duck frequently under low-hanging pine boughs, their needles still heavy with morning dew that soaked through his jacket. The dog paused frequently, nose to the ground, following some invisible trail that led them deeper into territory Marcus had never fully explored. This section of the park was officially off-limits to hikers due to unstable terrain and abandoned mining infrastructure, but that hadn't stopped people from venturing in before. The Hartwells wouldn't be the first family to ignore posted warnings in search of adventure. After 2 hours of hiking, the trees began to thin, revealing a landscape scarred by decades of mining operations. Rusted equipment sat abandoned among piles of tailings, and the skeletal remains of processing buildings dotted the hillside like broken teeth. It was a graveyard of industrial ambition, slowly being reclaimed by nature, but still dangerous to anyone unfamiliar with its hidden hazards. Titan stopped abruptly at the edge of what appeared to be a sinkhole, his body rigid with tension. Marcus approached carefully, aware that the ground here could be undermined by old mine shafts and unstable excavations. As he drew closer, he could see that the depression wasn't natural. It was the collapsed entrance to what had once been a mining tunnel. The dog began to whimper, a sound Marcus had never heard from him before. It was plaintive, almost human in its distress, and it raised the hair on the back of Marcus's neck. Titan paced along the edge of the collapse, looking down into the darkness below, then back at Marcus with eyes that seemed to be pleading. Marcus pulled out his heavy-duty flashlight and shone it into the hole. The beam penetrated maybe 20 feet before being swallowed by the blackness, revealing loose rock and rotted timber supports. The air that rose from the depths carried the musty smell of decay and something else, something that made his stomach clench with recognition. "Jesus," he breathed, pulling out his radio. "Base camp? This is Marcus. I need a full recovery team at my coordinates immediately." The radio crackled to life. "Copy that, Marcus. What's your situation?" Marcus looked down at Titan, who had stopped pacing and was now sitting perfectly still, staring into the collapsed mine shaft. The dog's scarred face was impossible to read, but there was something in his posture that spoke of completion, of a journey finally reaching its end. "I think we've found them," Marcus said into the radio. "The Hartwell family. We're going to need ropes, lights, and probably the coroner." As they waited for the recovery team to arrive, Marcus sat beside Titan on the rocky ground. The dog leaned against him, solid and warm, and for the first time since they'd begun this search, Marcus allowed himself to acknowledge what he'd known deep down from the beginning. This wasn't going to be a rescue mission. It was going to be about bringing a family home and finally giving their loved ones the closure they desperately needed. The sun crested the mountains, casting long shadows across the mining site, and Marcus wondered how many other secrets lay buried in these hills, waiting for someone like Titan to find them. The storm hit without warning, transforming the mountain pass into a wall of swirling snow and ice. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter as Kodiak pressed against his legs, the dog's massive frame trembling not from cold, but from something deeper, recognition. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured, but his own voice carried an edge of unease. The coordinates from Elena's journal had led them here, to this desolate stretch of trail that seemed to exist in perpetual shadow between towering peaks. Even in summer, this place would have been forbidding. Now, with winter's grip tightening, it felt like stepping into a frozen tomb. Kodiak whined low in his throat and pawed at the ground, his scarred muzzle pointing toward a cluster of boulders barely visible through the driving snow. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly agitated over the past hour, his usual controlled alertness replaced by something bordering on desperation. Marcus checked his GPS again, though he could barely make out the screen through the accumulating ice. They were close, less than half a mile from the final coordinates Elena had marked, but visibility had dropped to mere feet, and the temperature was plummeting fast. Every instinct honed by 20 years in the wilderness screamed at him to find shelter, to wait out the storm. But something in Kodiak's urgency told him they couldn't afford to wait. The dog suddenly bolted forward, disappearing into the white wall ahead. Marcus cursed and followed, his boots sliding on the treacherous ground. "Kodiak, stay close!" He found the dog standing rigid beside what looked like a natural rock formation, but as Marcus approached, he realized it was more than that. Someone had stacked stones here, creating a deliberate cairn. Snow had drifted around it, but the structure was unmistakable, a marker left by someone who knew these mountains. Kodiak circled the cairn, whimpering, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Then he stopped, fixed on something Marcus couldn't see, and began to dig furiously at the base of the rocks. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" Marcus knelt beside the dog, brushing away snow and loose stones. His gloved fingers touched something that didn't belong, fabric, partially buried and frozen stiff. With growing urgency, he cleared away more debris, revealing a small backpack, child-sized and bearing the faded logo of a cartoon character. His heart hammered against his ribs. This had to belong to one of the Chen children. But if the pack was here, where were they? Kodiak had moved on, following some invisible trail that led away from the cairn toward what appeared to be a solid rock face. The dog stopped at what looked like a narrow gap between two massive boulders, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. He looked back at Marcus, ears forward, tail rigid. A cave? Marcus pulled out his flashlight and aimed the beam into the opening. The light revealed a passage that curved out of sight, carved by countless years of water flow. It was tight but navigable, and more importantly, it would provide shelter from the storm that was rapidly becoming life-threatening. As they squeezed through the opening, Marcus felt the immediate relief of being out of the wind. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and his flashlight beam revealed signs of recent habitation. Blackened, stones arranged in a fire circle, scattered cans that looked like they might have once contained food, and in the far corner, huddled together under what remained of an emergency blanket, 3 still forms. "Jesus!" Marcus breathed, rushing forward with Kodiak at his side. The Chen family was here, David, Sarah, and their 8-year-old daughter, Lily. They were unconscious but breathing, their lips blue with cold, their bodies pressed together for warmth. The emergency supplies scattered around them told the story. They'd survived here for weeks, maybe months, slowly running out of food and fuel as winter closed in. Marcus immediately began first aid, checking pulses and breathing, while Kodiak lay down beside Lily, sharing his body heat. The dog's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. He'd been with this family, had somehow escaped or been sent for help, only to be found battered and traumatized by another search team that never made the connection. "You've been trying to lead someone back here all along, haven't you?" Marcus said softly, running his hand along Kodiak's scarred flank. "You never gave up on them." David Chen stirred as Marcus wrapped him in his own emergency blanket. His eyes opened, unfocused and confused, but when he saw Kodiak, tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Koda," he whispered hoarsely, "you came back." Marcus activated his emergency beacon, though he knew rescue would be impossible until the storm passed. For now, they were all trapped together in this stone sanctuary, but they were alive, and after months of searching, that was enough. He built up the fire while Kodiak maintained his vigil, the faithful guardian who had finally led someone home. The cave stretched deeper than Marcus had imagined, the beam of his flashlight swallowed by darkness that seemed to have weight. Bear pressed against his leg, the dog's massive frame trembling, not with fear but with something else, recognition maybe, or memory. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, though his own voice betrayed his tension. The air grew colder with each step, carrying scents of damp earth and something else, something that made his stomach clench. 20 feet in, Bear stopped dead. His hackles rose, and a low whine escaped his throat. Marcus followed the dog's gaze to where his flashlight beam caught something pale against the dark stone wall. Scratches, deliberate marks carved into the rock. "Help us," the message read in shaky letters. Below it, smaller scratches formed a rough calendar. Marcus counted the marks. 4 months' worth. "Jesus," he breathed. His radio crackled, Sarah's voice cutting through the cave's oppressive silence. "Marcus, we've got teams converging on your position. What's your status?" "I'm in the cave. Sarah, they were here. Recent markings." He paused, studying the wall more carefully. "And there's something else." Bear had moved ahead, his nose to the ground. The dog stopped at what looked like a pile of stones arranged too deliberately to be natural. Marcus approached carefully, his light revealing the makeshift cairn. Beneath the rocks, wrapped in a torn piece of fabric, lay a small notebook. With shaking hands, Marcus opened it. The pages were damp but readable. Jenny Morrison's handwriting filled the first entries, hopeful notes about their camping trip, excitement about showing the kids the wilderness. Then the tone shifted. "Day 3 got turned around somehow. David thinks we can find the trail, but I'm not sure. The kids are scared. Day 8 found this cave. David's leg is bad, infection setting in. Kids are hungry. That dog is still following us, staying just out of sight. Marcus's blood chilled as he read on. Bear whined again, pawing at something deeper in the cave. Day 15. David's fever broke, but he can't walk far. We've been leaving markers, hoping someone will find them. The dog came closer today. Sarah threw him some food. He's hurt bad, but he won't let us near. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. Bear had found the family first, had been trying to help them. The scars, the wariness of humans. He'd been surviving out here for months, staying close to people who couldn't help him and couldn't be helped. Day 23. David's getting worse again. Going to try to get the kids out tomorrow. If something happens to us, if anyone finds this, we tried to mark the way. Follow the stones. The final entry was in different handwriting. Shakier. A child's writing. Day 25. Mom said to write. Dad can't get up. We're going to try to find help. The dog is with us now. He's not scary anymore. Marcus's flashlight swept the cave floor frantically until he spotted them. Small stones arranged in an arrow pattern, pointing deeper into the cave system. Bear was already moving in that direction, his purpose clear now. The radio crackled again. Marcus, we've got eyes on the cave entrance. Need you to report status. Following a trail inside. The family was here, but they moved deeper. I'm going after them. Negative. Wait for backup. But Marcus was already moving, following Bear and the stone markers. The cave branched, and each time he hesitated, Bear chose the path without doubt. Left, then right, then straight through a narrow passage that opened into a larger chamber. The smell hit him first. Not death, but sickness, infection, human waste, fear. His light found them in the far corner of the chamber. David Morrison lay unconscious on a bed of pine boughs, his face gaunt and flushed with fever. Jenny sat beside him, her arm around two small forms. All three were conscious, barely, but their eyes reflected his flashlight beam like wild animals. Please, Jenny whispered, her voice cracked and barely audible. Are you real? Bear approached them slowly, tail wagging low. The smaller child, Sarah, Marcus realized, reached out with trembling fingers to touch the dog's scarred muzzle. He found you, she whispered. We told him to find someone. He found you. Marcus keyed his radio with shaking hands. Base, this is Marcus. I need medical evac at my position immediately. I've got them, all four. They're alive. As he spoke, Bear settled beside the family. The same protective posture Marcus had seen that first day at the shelter. The dog had been protecting them all along, staying close even when they couldn't care for him, waiting for someone who could help them all. Jenny Morrison looked up at Marcus with eyes that had seen too much. He never left us, she whispered. Even when we had nothing to give him, he never left. Marcus knelt beside them, already assessing injuries, planning the evacuation. But part of him was thinking about loyalty, about the kind of love that endures without reward, without hope of return. The storm hit with a vengeance that made their previous encounters with mountain weather seem like gentle spring showers. Marcus pressed his back against the cave wall, feeling the vibrations of thunder rolling through the rock itself. Outside, lightning split the darkness in violent white bursts, illuminating sheets of rain that fell almost horizontally in the howling wind. Rex paced near the cave mouth, his massive frame silhouetted against the intermittent flashes. Every few minutes, he would turn back toward Marcus and whine, a sound that cut through the storm's roar like a blade. The dog's agitation had been building for hours, ever since they'd taken shelter. I know, boy, Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the tempest. But we can't go out in this, not even for them. The them hung heavy between man and dog. Sarah Chen and her children were still out there somewhere, and if Marcus's calculations were correct, they were running out of time. The coordinates from David's final transmission had led them to this section of the wilderness, but the storm had forced them to take cover before they could complete their search. Rex let out a sharp bark and began pawing at something near the cave entrance. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and moved closer, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal what had captured the dog's attention. Scratched into the stone wall, barely visible beneath a thin layer of moss and dirt, were letters. Human-made marks. Marcus's pulse quickened as he brushed away the debris. SC plus Kids, Day 3 emerged under his careful cleaning. Below that, an arrow pointing deeper into the cave system. Sarah Chen, he whispered. They were here. Rex was already moving, his nose to the ground as he followed a scent trail that led into the cave's depths. Marcus grabbed his pack and followed, the flashlight beam dancing ahead of them as they navigated the narrow passages. The cave extended much farther than he'd initially realized, a network of tunnels that twisted and branched through the mountain's heart. They found more markings as they progressed. Day 4, running low. Day 6, kids holding up. The messages painted a picture of a family trying to survive, rationing whatever supplies they had while waiting for rescue that never came. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and Marcus's light revealed the remnants of a makeshift camp. Scattered clothing, empty water bottles, and the cold ashes of a small fire. But no bodies. No immediate signs of tragedy. Rex circled the area, his nose working overtime. He paused at the far end of the chamber, where another passage led deeper into the mountain. His tail wagged once, the first hopeful sign Marcus had seen from the dog in hours. "They went that way?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Rex was already moving, and Marcus followed, hope and dread warring in his chest. The passage sloped downward, and Marcus could hear something that made his heart race, the distant sound of running water. An underground stream, which meant a water source. It also meant the family might have followed it, seeking not just water but a possible way out of the cave system. The tunnel curved sharply, and suddenly they emerged into a vast underground chamber. Marcus's flashlight beam seemed to disappear into the darkness above, unable to find the ceiling. The sound of water was louder here, echoing off unseen walls, but there was something else, something that made Rex bark excitedly and bound forward. Light. Not flashlight beams or reflected lightning, but the grey light of dawn filtering down from somewhere above. Marcus followed Rex toward the source, his heart hammering as they climbed over fallen rocks and navigated around pools of standing water. They found the opening 50 feet up the chamber wall, a natural chimney that led to the surface. And there, scattered around its base, were more signs of human habitation. Fresh ones. Marcus called up through the opening, his voice echoing in the stone throat above them. "Sarah! Sarah Chen! Can you hear me?" The response came immediately, a weak voice, barely human but unmistakably alive. "Help, please! We're here!" Rex was already scrambling up the rockfall that led toward the opening, his powerful legs finding purchase on surfaces that would challenge an experienced climber. Marcus followed, adrenaline giving him strength as he hauled himself upward, hand over hand. The chimney was narrow, barely wide enough for Marcus's shoulders, but it climbed steadily toward the surface. About 30 feet up, it widened into a small chamber, and there they were. Sarah Chen sat propped against the wall, her arm clearly broken, her face gaunt with hunger and dehydration. Beside her, 2 small forms huddled under what remained of their jackets. The children were alive, but barely conscious. "We knew," Sarah whispered as Rex gently licked her face, his tail wagging furiously. "We knew someone would come. David, he promised." Marcus was already reaching for his radio, praying the storm had passed enough for a signal to get through. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Marcus cradled the unconscious girl against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. Bear limped beside them, his massive frame trembling with exhaustion, blood matting the fur around his shoulder where Kellerman's final shot had found its mark. The dog's golden eyes never left the child, even as the EMTs rushed forward with a stretcher. "She's hypothermic and dehydrated, but her vitals are stable," the paramedic shouted over the noise, gently taking Sarah from Marcus's arms. "How long has she been out here?" 7 months, Marcus replied, his voice hoarse. The number seemed impossible even to him. The paramedic's eyes widened in disbelief. but he quickly refocused on his patient, wrapping her in heated blankets and starting and forth. Marcus watched helplessly as they loaded her into the medical helicopter, knowing he couldn't accompany her due to weight restrictions and Bear's injuries. "We'll take good care of her," the pilot assured him. "Memorial Hospital. You can meet us there once you get down the mountain." As the helicopter lifted off, Marcus knelt beside Bear, running his hands carefully over the dog's wounds. The bullet had passed through the muscle of his shoulder, painful but not life-threatening. More concerning were the dozens of cuts and scratches from their desperate flight through the forest, and the obvious exhaustion that had the powerful animal barely able to stand. "You did it, boy," Marcus whispered, pressing his forehead against Bear's massive skull. "You brought her home." The rescue team that had been tracking them finally caught up, their radios crackling with updates on Kellerman's capture and the discovery of his remote cabin. Detective Reeves emerged from the tree line, his face grim but relieved. "Kellerman's talking," he said without preamble. "Seems like facing a life sentence loosened his tongue. The parents, they're buried near the cabin. He panicked when they got too close to his operation. Tried to scare them off first, but when that didn't work, he shook his head. The girl's been living in that bunker for months. He was planning to move her, start fresh somewhere else." Marcus closed his eyes, grief and rage warring in his chest. Tom and Linda Chen would never see their daughter grow up, would never know that she had survived because of their determination to stay together as a family. But Sarah was alive, and that had to be enough. "There's something else," Reeves continued. "The cabin's filled with evidence of other disappearances. Cases going back years across multiple states. This is bigger than we thought." The trek down the mountain took 3 hours, with Marcus and 2 other rangers taking turns carrying Bear on a makeshift stretcher when the dog could no longer walk. The big animal never complained, but Marcus could see the pain in his eyes, the way his body shook with each step. At the veterinary clinic, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the same vet who had initially examined Bear months ago, worked quickly to clean and dress his wounds. "He's lost blood, but nothing vital was hit," she reported. "The exhaustion is my biggest concern. His body's been running on adrenaline for hours. He needs rest, fluids, and time to heal." "But he'll be okay?" "He's tough as nails, Marcus. Just like when you first brought him to me. Though I have to say I never expected his story to end like this." Marcus stayed with Bear through the night, dozing fitfully in a chair beside the recovery kennel. Every few hours he would check on the dog, relieved each time to find him breathing steadily, his condition slowly stabilizing. Dawn brought news from the hospital. Sarah Chen was awake and asking for the big dog. Physically, she was malnourished and weak, but the doctors were amazed by her resilience. Psychologically, the trauma would take years to process, but she was talking, responsive, and asking about her parents with the heartbreaking hope of a child who didn't yet understand her loss. When Marcus arrived at the hospital with Bear, against protocol, but with the blessing of a sympathetic doctor who understood what the dog meant to the girl, Sarah's face lit up for the first time since her rescue. She was tiny in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and tubes, but her eyes were bright and alert. "Bear," she whispered, reaching out with a small hand. The dog approached carefully, his movements still stiff from his injuries, and gently placed his massive head within reach of her fingers. Marcus watched as months of careful trust and protection passed between them in that simple touch. "He saved me," Sarah said softly, looking up at Marcus. "When the bad man got angry, Bear always stood in front of me. He shared his food and kept me warm and never let me give up." Marcus felt tears burn his eyes as he realized the full extent of what Bear had done. This wasn't just about finding a missing family. It was about a dog who had chosen to become someone's protector, who had found purpose in the most impossible circumstances. The helicopter's rotors beat steadily overhead as Marcus watched the rescue team secure the Hendersons onto stretchers. Sarah Henderson's eyes fluttered open for brief moments, searching frantically until she spotted her children. 8-year-old Katie clung to her father's hand, while 12-year-old Ben sat quietly, his face pale but alert. They were dehydrated, malnourished and exhausted, but they were alive. Marcus knelt beside Goliath, running his fingers through the massive dog's coarse fur. The animal lay panting heavily, his scarred muzzle resting against Marcus's knee. 3 days of relentless tracking through treacherous terrain had pushed them both to their limits, but the dog had never wavered from his mission. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured. "You did it. You brought them home." The paramedic approached with her medical kit. "We need to get that leg looked at," she said, gesturing to the makeshift bandage Marcus had wrapped around Goliath's injured foreleg, where it had been caught in an old trap near the cave. "He's been through worse," Marcus replied, but his voice carried deep concern. The dog had been limping for the last mile, though he'd refused to stop until the family was safe. Detective Sarah Chen crouched beside them, her notebook already filled with preliminary details. "The cave system where you found them. It's nearly 2 miles from where their campsite was discovered. How did you know to look there?" Marcus glanced down at Goliath, whose dark eyes remained alert despite his exhaustion. He knew, somehow, he remembered exactly where they were. He paused, watching as David Henderson was helped into the helicopter. "The father told me Goliath stayed with them for 3 days after they fell into that ravine, kept them warm, helped them find water. When David's leg got infected and he couldn't travel, the dog left to find help, and walked straight into that county shelter 60 miles away," Chen added, shaking her head in amazement, "where he waited 4 months for someone to listen to what he was trying to say." The helicopter lifted off, carrying the Henderson family toward the regional hospital. Marcus watched it disappear over the tree line, feeling an odd mixture of triumph and emptiness. For months, this mystery had consumed him. Now, with the family safe, he wasn't sure what came next. Goliath struggled to his feet, favoring his injured leg but determined to stand. The dog's gaze followed the helicopter until it vanished completely, then turned to Marcus with what looked almost like relief. "We should get you to a vet," Marcus said, but Goliath had already started walking toward the trail that would lead them back to Marcus's truck. Even injured, the dog moved with purpose, as if he too understood that this chapter of their story was ending. The hike back took twice as long as usual. Marcus matched Goliath's slower pace, using the time to process everything that had happened. When they'd first found that cave, hidden behind a curtain of fallen rocks and overgrown vegetation, he'd almost missed it entirely. But Goliath had known exactly where to look, had led him to a narrow opening that required crawling on hands and knees to access. Inside, they'd discovered the Henderson family huddled in a natural chamber, weak but conscious. Sarah Henderson had wept when she saw Goliath, calling him by name, explaining through tears how the dog had saved their lives after they'd fallen while hiking off-trail. They'd been trapped, David's broken leg making travel impossible, when Goliath had appeared as if summoned by their desperation. By the time Marcus and Goliath reached the truck, the sun was setting behind the mountains. Marcus opened the passenger door, and Goliath jumped in without hesitation, a routine they'd developed over the past few weeks. The drive to the veterinary clinic was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Dr. Martinez examined Goliath's leg with gentle hands. Superficial lacerations, some muscle strain, but nothing that won't heal with rest, she announced. "This is one tough dog. You have no idea," Marcus replied. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Dr. Martinez handed Marcus a bottle of antibiotics and detailed care instructions. "He'll need to take it easy for a few weeks. No more wilderness adventures for a while." Marcus looked down at Goliath, who was already eyeing the exit door. "I think he's ready for some downtime anyway. We both are." Outside the clinic, Marcus opened the truck door again, but this time Goliath hesitated. The dog looked back toward the mountains, then up at Marcus, as if asking a question. "Yeah, boy," Marcus said quietly. "We're going home." For the first time since he'd rescued the scarred, aggressive dog from the shelter, that word felt completely right. They weren't just a ranger and a rescue animal anymore. They were partners. They were family. Goliath settled into his seat with a deep sigh, finally allowing himself to rest.